So this little video lecture is going to deal with the plasma membrane, which is commonly called the cell membrane, which is probably one of the more important parts of the cell, because if it wasn't built the way that it was, the cell wouldn't exist. We would just be a puddle of water because we would dissolve. But the plasma membrane is what we call a phospholipid bilayer. And so the term lipids there means it has fat in it. And you guys know that fat and water don't mix. So by having this layer of fat around our cells, it allows us to exist. The plasma membrane is also responsible for letting stuff in and out. So it's kind of like having a wall with a door. So that's what we need to focus on in this video. Now, again, in the case of plasma membrane, remember its main job is to control what enters and leaves the cell. So you can think of the room that you're sitting in as the inside of the cell and the walls being the plasma membrane. And you probably have a window, you have a door, and you get to decide when you're going to open that door. You get to decide when you're going to leave that door open. You get to decide when you're going to open and close your window. But there's some things that can just get in by themselves. They can get in under the cracks, they can get in through your screen, and that's kind of how the plasma membrane works. And so its main job is to maintain what's called homeostasis. The cell needs to have a certain amount of stuff inside of it. And so the plasma membrane, one of the plasma membrane's job is to make sure that your cell doesn't get too much water. If your cell gets too much water, it's going to explode. It needs to make sure that your cell doesn't lose too much water. Your cell doesn't get dehydrated, so it doesn't shrivel up and die. It also needs to make sure that nutrients are allowed in and waste products are allowed out. And all of this works because of the structure. Remember, structure determines function. So when we look at the plasma membrane, it is what we call a selectively permeable membrane. I always compare the plasma membrane to a screen. We all have screen doors or we have screens on our windows. And you know that those screens have little itsy bitsy openings in them. Well, think of your plasma membrane as being the same way. It is the screen. And if you're small enough to get through that screen, then you can come and go whenever you want to. So it's like you sitting on your screened-in porch. You know that pollen and dust and maybe small ants are able to get in through the openings in the screen. And you don't do any work. You're just sitting there and the breeze is blowing through the screen or the pollen's blowing through the screen. You did nothing to make that stuff move into your screened-in porch. That's going to be what we call passive transport. And that's how most cells prefer to work. So in the case of plasma membrane, it's going to have, think of it as little small openings. And if you're small enough to get back and forth through those little openings, you can go in and out of the cell whenever you want to. And the cell doesn't have to do anything. However, some things are too big to get in through the screen. So again, it's like you're sitting on your screen-in porch and the air is blowing in. You're not having to fan yourself. It's a nice pleasant day. The breeze is blowing because the air can get through those gaps. However, your dog wants to come in. You have to say, okay, do I want to get up out of my comfy chair and go let my dog in? So you have to decide whether or not you're going to open a door. You have to select whether or not you're going to let something onto your screen porch. That's what we mean when we say the plasma membrane is selectively permeable. It's going to select what's allowed to go in and out. Permeable means to pass through. So by being selectively permeable, it's only going to allow certain molecules to pass through. Other times it will block them, or it will just decide, I'm not going to open the door. And this is what we call active and passive cellular transport, which is another video. So in the case of the function of the plasma membrane, its main job is to let nutrients into the cell, keep harmful ions and molecules out. It also needs to make sure it gets rid of extra stuff. Yeah, water is good for the cell, but too much water in the cell can make the cell explode. So the plasma membrane has to be able to let that extra water out, and it also has to help it get rid of waste products. So again, just another way of saying it, the plasma membrane is a function. It's a barrier that surrounds the cells and controls what enters. Its job is to maintain homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is this idea of equilibrium. There's an equal amount of water on the inside, there's equal amount of water on the outside. That way the cell doesn't explode, that way the cell doesn't dehydrate and shrink. All cells in nature have a plasma membrane. Bacteria, animals, plants, every single cell in nature has a plasma membrane. That's one of the rules about being a cell. And it's made up of this wonderful structure called a phospholipid bilayer, which we're going to talk about in more detail. So in the case of the plasma membrane, it is, again, what we call a phospholipid bilayer. Bi meaning it's two layers of phospholipids. So right here, we have our phospholipid bilayer. Okay. A phospholipid has a head, and it has two tails. Okay. The heads, what's in purple, those are hydrophilic, which means they like being in water. Because if you'll notice, there's water on the outside of the cell, and there's water on the inside of the cell. And your heads are made from phosphates. That's where the phospho part comes in. The tails, these little squiggly lines here, are hydrophobic, which means they don't like being in water. That's because the tails are made from the lipids. So if you'll notice, surrounding our cells, we have two layers of fat. That makes our cells basically kind of waterproof. That makes sure that our cells don't dissolve. If we didn't have these phospholipids, then life as we know it would not exist because we would have dissolved, basically melted away. We would be puddles of water. Now, think of it this way. I mentioned that the plasma membrane is like a screen door. Well, the heads are always drawn as circles. So think of you as having a box full of tennis balls. Now, if you put a bunch of tennis balls in a box, because they're circular, they don't fit together perfectly. There's still going to be space between those tennis balls. Think of that as the openings in the screen. As you can see, there's space between these phospholipids. So if you are small enough to get through that space, just like a screen, you can go in and out anytime you want to. And that's what nature likes. Nature wants to be lazy. Your cells have a gasoline that runs them. And the gasoline that runs your cells is called ATP. Adenosine triphosphate. Just like your car needs gasoline in order to run, and the more you run your car, you can run out of gas, your cells need a chemical called ATP to run. And the more work the cells have to do, the more of this gasoline they're going to use up. So nature wants to be as lazy as possible. It's like when you drive your car, you ride your bike, you know when you go downhill, you can stop pedaling. You just let gravity take you. You don't have to do any work. That's what we call passive transport. And that's what nature likes to do. Nature likes to do what's called passive transport. Nature wants things to go in and out of the cell without the cell having to do any work. So in the case of the screen, like I mentioned, you're sitting on your screen and porch and the breeze is blowing. You're not having to fan yourself. You're not having to, do whatever you can to cool yourself. Nature's doing it for you. You're not having to do any work. And so that is one of the jobs of the plasma membrane, is to do what's called passive transport. It's going to allow things to go in and out like a screen door. And you're like, what does that have to do with the structure? Well, again, remember, the heads are always drawn as a circle. These are phosphates, and they're hydrophilic, which means they don't mind being in water. The tails are the lipids. They're hydrophobic. They don't like water. That's what makes our cells, it's like a waterproof barrier. Well, if you think of the heads as being tennis balls all lined up in a box, that does leave you a small space. So that allows things to pass back and forth through that space, like a screen door. So again, just as a review, the heads are the phosphates, and they are what we call polar. If you see something that's polar, that means water is its friend. It doesn't mind being in water. And over time, the phosphates will dissolve. We just put new ones on there. So the polar heads face outward. Okay? They're going to face the outside and the inside. So this would be the outside of the cell. This would be the inside of the cell. And there's water on the outside of the cell, and there's water on the inside of the cell. So they don't mind being in water. So that's what we call hydrophilic. Now, the tails face inward. And the tails, this portion here, are your lipids. And lipids are nonpolar. If you're nonpolar, that means you don't like water. So if you mix oil and water together, the oil floats on top because it's nonpolar. And so by having this structure, it basically keeps our cells from dissolving. And it gives us a little screen so things can pass in and out. With the shape of our cells, or with the way that our cells work, we call our cells a fluid mosaic model. Now, we've known for years the parts of the cell. We knew it contained these phospholipids. We knew it contained different proteins. We knew it had sugar on it. We just didn't know how it all came together. And we now have a model we call the fluid mosaic model. Now, in science, fluid means not that it's a liquid, but fluid means something is flexible. Your cell is flexible. It can change shape. It can stretch a little bit. It can shrink a little bit. Okay. We need that because our body changes. Water levels fluctuate. So our cell membrane is flexible. That's what the fluid portion of the name comes from. In the case mosaic, if you do art, mosaic art tends to be like you take pottery and you just crush that pottery, you smash it, and then you take the little pieces and you put those little pieces together to make your piece of art. Well, mosaic means multiple parts. So the fluid portion means that our cell membrane is fluid, it's flexible. Mosaic lets you know that our cell membrane is made up of lots of different parts. And in our cell membrane, we do have the phospholipids. And my handwriting really is not this messy, it's just hard to write on the screen. It contains different types of proteins. It contains cholesterol. And it contains different types of sugars. So there's lots of different pieces on our cells, and that's where the mosaic portion of the name comes from. Now, depending on what kind of cell you have, you're going to have different sugars, you're going to have different proteins, but phospholipids are phospholipids and cholesterol is cholesterol. So we're going to look at this in more detail. Now, like I mentioned, in the case of the current model, it is called the fluid mosaic model. And the reason that it is fluid, the reason it is flexible, is because of the fatty acid tails. Well, if you think about it, fats don't like water. So the fats are constantly going to be moving in order to get away from water. Well, water is constantly leaking through, like shooting through it, like if I were to take a hose and shoot it at you through the screen. And so those little fats, legs, are constantly going to be going back and forth. So that allows the cell to be flexible. It also has this thing, it also has cholesterol. Here's the cholesterol right here, so it's yellows. I always use the example, if I were to take all my students and line them up, and I would stack them together as tight as possible, and I asked you to move, you would have a hard time moving side to side. Well, look at all these phospholipids stacked in there together. Well, what if I gave some of them beach balls, and I told them to tuck that beach ball underneath their arm? Now all of a sudden, there's a space between you and your partner, and that space gives you room to move. So cholesterol is found every so often as basically like a little spacer between the phospholipids, and that allows the phospholipids, your plasma membrane, to move a little bit. The mosaic properties come from proteins and sugars. Okay? Now, like I said, depending on what kind of cell you are, you're going to have different kinds of proteins, but all plasma membranes have proteins in their cells. And they also have different types of sugars. So if you'll notice in this picture, you'll see these things that look like antennae. Okay. These are sugars. And these sugars can be used as markers, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. So, like I mentioned, in the case of the plasma membrane, we do have this cholesterol. And its formal definition is to stabilize the membrane and to keep the fatty acids from sticking together. Think of it as being that little beach ball that I kind of put in the middle, and it kind of gives them room to flex. We do have the lipids, which make up most of the membranes. And then, like I mentioned, we have these carbohydrates. When you see carbohydrates on the plasma membrane, they're always drawn to look like antenna, like that right there. Okay? Just like you have an antenna in your phone, just like you have an antenna in your TV. Back in the day, we actually had this big metal antenna sticking off the top of our house. And the job of the antenna is to gather information. And we can also use that antenna to mark our cells. Somehow nature has to know, okay, what kind of cell is this? Is this a stomach cell? Is this a brain cell? Well, our cells have something called the glycocalyx on it. Glyco, as you know, means sugar, Calyx means layer, okay? The glycocalyx. So all of our cells have like this thin layer of sugar on them. And the sugar is these antenna things that you see. And that helps, and so different kinds of cells will have a different type of glycocalyx. So your stomach cells have one kind of sugar layer on them, and your brain cells have a different kind of sugar layer on them. And so that's how it's used as a marker. It marks that cell. And then we have proteins that provide for transport. So, speaking of proteins, we actually have two kinds of proteins that we might find in our membrane. So in this picture here, you'll notice these little orange balls. These little orange balls are your phosphates. You then have, down at the bottom, you can see the little lipids on the inside, and you can see every so often we have a cholesterol molecule. And then right here, you can see our antenna, that's our sugar, and you'll see these big purple blobs. Well, we need to talk about these big purple blobs. These are examples of proteins that we have in or on our plasma membrane. In the case of our plasma membrane, we divide the proteins up into two groups. You have what we call integral proteins, and you have what we call peripheral proteins. In this picture, these 5 purple blobs are all examples of integral proteins. Integral proteins will go all the way through the membrane. So you can see here, we've got the top of the membrane, we've got the bottom of the membrane, and this protein goes all the way through. These are what we call integral proteins. I want you to think of integral proteins as the doors. Like I said, if you think of the room you're sitting in as a cell, the walls would be the plasma membrane. And you have a door that you can go in and out of. You have a window that's open. Well, or let's just use the example of a screen and porch. You've got these screens all around you, but then there's a door. Well, some things are just allowed to go in and out of the screens whenever they want to, like pollen, small insects, the wind. And then you've got a door to let bigger things in. Well, that door in the plasma membrane are these things called integral proteins. Sometimes something like a sugar needs to get inside of your cell, but it's too big to move through the screen. So your cell has to say, okay, let me open the door and let it in. And so it uses these things called integral proteins in order to do that. So there's different types of integral proteins just based on how they change shape. So you can think of this one here as being a protein that's closed. And proteins are picky. So you have certain integral proteins that will only work if a sugar attaches to them. You have some integral proteins that only work if another type of protein attaches to them. Proteins are picky. But let's just say that this protein door is closed and a sugar lands on it. What the protein has to do, it has to change shape in order to open. And just depending on how it changes its shape, that's how these different integral proteins get their names. Okay. If it curls up and forms a tube, so stuff can just slide in or out, that's called a channel protein. It forms a tunnel. Okay. But others will change shape and kind of open and close, open and close. If they do that, that's called a carrier protein. Both of them are integral proteins. Both of them go all the way through the plasma membrane, and both of them will open and close like a door. They're going to let things in or out. Now, you also have something called a receptor protein. Now, I'm going to switch to a different picture, or actually, we're going to have something called a receptor protein, or a peripheral protein. Peripheral proteins do not go all the way through. Okay. I'm going to draw a peripheral protein on here. Okay. I'm going to make a peripheral protein right here. Peripheral proteins are only on the surface. And peripheral proteins tend to have sugars stuck to them, or they might have a lipid stuck to them. And so in the case of a peripheral protein, you might have a sugar antenna attached to you. And like I mentioned, some of these are what we call markers, marker proteins. These will mark that cell. So for example, every cell in your body has the same marker protein on it. That's how your body knows it's your cell. That's how your immune system works. Your immune system doesn't know if something's a bacteria. Your immune system doesn't know if something is a virus. It just knows it's not yours because it doesn't have your protein on it. And then cells will have, like stomach cells will have one kind of marker on it. Brain cells will have another kind of marker on it. And proteins that have sugars attached to them are called glycoproteins. Glyco because it's a sugar, protein because it's attached to it. We also have receptor proteins. Receptor proteins are like telephone poles. They are proteins with sugars attached to them, and those proteins will act as a way for cells to talk to each other. Okay, cells talk to each other by making hormones. So think of receptor proteins as being two baseball players, and they have to throw the baseball back and forth. And so you have to be able to catch that baseball. And so that's kind of what receptor proteins do. Let me erase. All right. So like I mentioned, we have channel proteins that allow things to go in and out. Carrier proteins and channel proteins do the same thing. Okay? It's just all based on how they change the shape. Okay? Receptor proteins help the cell transport and gather information, and marker proteins say, hey, I'm a stomach cell, or hey, I'm a brain cell. So here again, just in this picture, all these balls in white represent the phosphates. You can see the squiggly legs, which represent the lipids. These yellow things here represent the cholesterol. And then this protein here and this protein here are examples of transport proteins. Right? They are integral proteins. They just happen to be channel proteins. Remember, these go all the way through, and so they act as doors to move things in or out. These guys here, for example, is a glycoprotein. That is a peripheral protein. It does not go all the way through, and it has a sugar attached to it. Now, it might be a receptor protein. Those sugars might be there to act as baseball gloves to catch the ball, to catch the information. It might be a marker protein. That sugar might be there to say, hey, I'm this type of cell. But remember, when we talk about the plasma membrane, some things can go in and out whenever they want to, like oxygen. Oxygen is small enough just to go back and forth through the screen door. If you're not small enough to go back and forth through the screen door, remember, I have to open a door for you. And that's the plasma membrane.